My name is Luke and I'm the Deputy President for TU Dublin Students' Union, the Blanchardstown campus. This series is to encourage students to run for election and kind of bridge that political gap between students and kind of the wider politics. Throughout this series, we'll be joined by multiple progressive community leaders and explore topics such as minority groups and leadership, why bother running, and learning a little bit more about our guests each session. Today, I am joined by the incredible Ruth Coppinger from the Socialist Party in Dublin 15. For the benefit of our students watching today, would you be able to tell us a little bit about yourself, Ruth? So kind of along the lines of who you are and what you do.
Right. Well, I suppose I'm a political activist. I'm a socialist feminist, and I was a TD for 6 years from 2014 to last year, 2020. Before that, I would have been a councillor in the Mulhuddard ward for a long time as well. So I'd be very familiar with all the issues in the greater Blanchardstown area, but obviously nationally as well. And I'm continuing to fight on all of those issues, and I continue to be an activist as well.
That's brilliant. And I suppose kind of following on from that then, why do you do what you do? Because I think that's an extremely kind of important topic to touch on. And maybe if you could share maybe one or two accomplishments with us that you'd like to share with our students.
Well, why I do what I do, ever since I've been 17, I was an activist at school. I kind of mentally took a decision when I was in sixth year that, oh, I'll do my leaving and then I'll get involved in that. So I became active in socialism. Now, at the time, it was a recession, there was no jobs, everyone was emigrating, a bit like now. And this is my third recession, I think. But I just saw the inequality and injustice throughout the world. The idea that some people have no chance of a decent life. And I suppose a burning sense of injustice. And when I read about socialism, I thought, well, that is the way to resolve this. We have the wealth, we have the resources, but they're not in the hands of the majority. So in terms of accomplishments that you were asking in the second part of that, I suppose the two things that I'd be most proud of would be the role that I played in repeal, and I suppose the water charges as well. So maybe starting with repeal, I think I was able to use my position in the Dáil to really push the political establishment, who were reluctant, to put it mildly, to change the law. But it was the movement outside, of course, of young people, LGBT plus people, women, working class people as well, who pushed for those changes. And I was active outside of Parliament too, in creating, groups like Rosa and others, and highlighting the reality of the lack of abortion in the country. And then in terms of the other issue, I suppose the water charges would have been a big issue. A lot of people watching will know from even their parents how big that was 5, 6, 7 years ago. And I played a role in calling for non-payment, in building community campaigns against it. And then, of course, when I got elected in a by-election in 2014, that would have also been a strong signal of political opposition to the charges. So they would be two, I think, recent roles that I've played.
Yeah, no, that's really, really good. And I think you kind of touched on something really important there, kind of on the water charges. About even, I remember my own time, my own mum, even kind of like the sense of community around that, that really banded together and kind of saying, no, we're not doing this, we're not being taken advantage of. And I suppose then that's kind of, really important, because it kind of focusing in on kind of the importance of running for leadership roles. Then there are so many kind of like perceived barriers for people. There's this perception that politics, be it local or otherwise, even from a students' union all the way up to ministerial level, that it's a game that no matter, it doesn't, to get elected, you need to be the coolest person in the room or with the most brown envelopes to hand out, or that it's designed for the wider population and not for minorities within kind of a larger society. Have you ever encountered any of those barriers, if you're comfortable with sharing? And why do you think it's important to run for these elections and run for these leadership roles to tackle those barriers?
Well, I suppose from my point of view, I obviously think getting elected is important, or I wouldn't have, done that. I don't think it's the only sides to politics, though. I think it's a smaller side, but you can certainly use an elected position to advance a cause and to advance very important issues, like in the case of students. Obviously, having positions and having people who are willing to fight in leading positions is critical. And in terms of barriers, well, you only have to look in the Dáil. The councils are actually probably even worse, believe it or not. It's very male, it's very pale, and it's very stale. And there's very few younger people. There's very few women. There's very few people of colour. There's very few, people that are. It's not really representative of society. So I think we do need to have a full reflection of that, be it in student politics or be it in Dáil or local election politics. Barriers, I suppose, look like any other woman. You're going to get sexism. You're going to get issues like that. I wouldn't say it was a huge barrier for me, but it is there, and it's been well accounted at the moment in terms of social media and so on. But I think, but there are other barriers for women as well, like childcare and family life and so on. But I'm sure there's barriers for people who are disabled, for people of colour, that are, even for like working class people in general. Like it's not easy to give up time. You mentioned yourself there, we were chatting before about jobs. And I'm sure if you're a student and you're trying to exist and get your way through college, to give up time to be a student leader is a huge sacrifice. So that is why it's all the more important to fight for change, to fight for decent grants and for, free fees, completely free, not the charades that we currently have. And unless people do that, we're never going to change anything. So, and we'll always have to just put up with the inequality and the barriers. So I'd strongly encourage people to try to overcome them and to do their best to do so.
100%. I had another guest on, so I did quite recently, and they were saying it's probably the one quote that resonated with me the most. It was like, then why bother putting your name on the ballot? And it was very much like, well, if not you, then who? And it's going to be those people who are putting up those barriers that they're going to be the ones who are getting on instead of you. So it's like so important to like just get in there and even getting topics that you're passionate about on that ballot, getting it on that can create that within itself creates conversation, and that is so important. And then Ruth, would I be able to ask then, has there been any work that obviously either yourself that you've already touched on, or even kind of any of your colleagues have done to ensure that we really tackle these issues, like these perceived barriers and those actual barriers as well, on the ground when it comes to kind of like breaking them down, be that through your work as a leader or kind of otherwise, to highlight to students why this means something?
I suppose that the role that I've played is in activist movements as well as in elected positions. So I'd be very active right now in assisting like things like racism that's happening here in our community in Dublin West, as I'm sure you're well aware, and encouraging people to participate in those broader movements, because that's where you then get the knowledge, get the confidence, and the wherewithal to then maybe go on to do other things. I obviously haven't been in a party that's been in power, so not much point in me pointing to that. But to be honest with you, it tends to be the smaller left parties that have produced a lot more diversity in any case. And a lot of the people who, like if you look at a lot of the women from Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, they do tend to be from the dynasties that those parties are associated with, and I won't start naming names, but they're just so obvious. And, that's not going to be a way of making change if we're going to just continue on that kind of cronyism and nepotism. So I believe that encouraging politics in the broadest sense, you know, really bringing it into communities, really bringing it into young people in all forums is probably the best way, because the more people that are involved in that small politics with a small p, well, then the more diverse it's likely to be in decision-making forums.
Yeah, that's 100%. And thank you so much for that. And I suppose then we've so many other issues then on top of that facing us, such as the climate crisis. And I say this every session, but it is so important to call it that. It is so important to call it a crisis, because we're standing on the precipice of an actual catastrophe about to happen. There is, you know, you always see those placards going around saying there's no planet B, and that is so true. You know, as we've seen even with the youth vote in the last election period, there is a starvation for a greener tomorrow. And obviously being a leader yourself, how do you think that our generation of kind of future leaders can make that difference in tackling climate as student leaders, even kind of going into their own SU elections?
I think this has been one of the most positive issues, in the sense that young people have gotten extremely active at such a young age, because they see the crisis, and the crisis is going to affect them more than anybody else. Unfortunately, that's temporarily paused with the pandemic, but it will no doubt return. And there's some parallels with the pandemic as well, because in some ways the pandemic is also linked to the way society has evolved. That's actually something even Mike Ryan has been highlighting from the WHO. You know, the role of big business and our further removal from nature and natural processes. I think you cannot separate out the climate catastrophe from the economic system that we have. Like, capitalism is a driver of the climate disaster. Just reading there today that I think 100 companies, people will have probably heard this figure, are responsible for 71% of all the emissions since the 1980s. But about 25 of those companies are responsible for 50%. And even during the pandemic, the top 1% have used up, you know, an incredible, I think it's something like half of the emissions of the poorest half of the planet, you know. So unless, if we continue with, for example, what I think the Green Party is striving to do, is to tinker with really small things, well, then we're not going to get change. And it's too urgent to adopt those old methods. And even then you could argue it's not been very successful even at that. So I do think that, you know, an eco-socialist approach is going to be necessary in terms of student unions and student union elections. This has to be one of the biggest, you know, broadest political issues that's raised. And I think school students have led the way, obviously. And I think, you know, the third level sector, if the two could be combined, it would become a really potent political force to force the politicians to make the change, because they represent big business and they're not going to do it unless they're forced to do it.
100%. And I think we even see it, even kind of throughout the pandemic, even we see kind of like the kind of virtual activism that's taken place, particularly even around the CETA deal at the minute. I know by the time this is like all filmed and produced and everything, we might have a vision on whether or not that our climate activism has been our eco activism has been set back 35 years or not. Hopefully it won't, but sure, look. Then I suppose we're kind of coming to an end on our kind of tea time chats. I suppose what I'd be able to ask you is to maybe touch on kind of the whole, why bother running at all, and why be that kind of change maker? Why be that leader within a students' union? As you know, this is around the time where that imposter syndrome starts setting in, where those kind of doubts really begin to set in with people saying, oh, Jesus, I couldn't do that, or, you know, I'm up against the surefire candidate who's going to win here, or, you know, I just can't do it. What would you say to that?
I think if you're running for any election, the first thing is, what do you stand for? And you have to actually think about, what are the key things that I'm putting forward that will persuade people to support you. It isn't always the loudest person, you know, it isn't always those attributes that are most needed. But I think if you know what you stand for, if you have genuine convictions, that will out, you know, when you speak at a meeting or whatever. I think the importance of it is that like we were talking earlier, it's only by political pressure, by movements taking place, that change actually comes about in society. And that's the lesson we have to take from repeal, from marriage equality, you know, two big changes that happened. Even recently during the pandemic, in fact, there has been some, like the image-based sexual abuse issue, that was tackled by people acting online, which is the only way you can kind of do most things now. Or even the mother and baby homes as well. Like the initial mantra of sealing the archives was completely pushed back because of a huge outcry by the public. And I think we do need people who will stand for positions and represent those views and use those positions to do that. I'm not one for advocating that you do it for your own career. We've seen far too much of that in student politics over the decades. Yeah. You know, you have to want to and really be a genuine person of conviction. Otherwise, don't bother.
100%. And I suppose I'm going to throw a very quick curveball at you now. Just as somebody who has kind of won all sorts of elections, have you any kind of campaign tips or tricks or kind of advice to anybody running their campaign at the minute, if they're kind of planning it and kind of getting it together? Is there any kind of advice that you give them?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't won every election. Obviously, I didn't win the one last year, unfortunately, but I had a good record before that. I think like I said, I would start with what is my program, what is my election, what are the ideas that I'm fighting for, and obviously they have to be ideas that are important to other people. Otherwise, there's no point. And to work those out and to put them together in a way that people understand, and that, you know, that are clear and that are sharp. And I think when you do that, then you need to obviously disseminate it as widely as you can. Social media is obviously a huge platform now. We're not in person at the moment in terms of colleges and campuses, but if we were, again, I do think in person still matters. And I do think, you know, the old fashioned leaflets and all of that, really, posters, make a difference. Holding meetings, talking to people, explaining to people, because actually I hope probably at the end of this, we'll all be sick of being online. So yeah. I think getting some people around you. Obviously for me, being in a party has been a big help. I don't know if I could do just being independent. It wouldn't be, I really don't know. I think you have to have, in my opinion, a party that stands for the same things, or try to build by party a political organization, you know, working with other people rather than just being a maverick, I think is important, whatever way you decide to do it. So I think having other people with you who work with you, but don't forget where you came from. Mm-hmm. Don't, once you get elected, then be above other people or leave behind the key principles that you got elected on, because if you do, obviously people won't be slow to recognize that.
100%. I think that's worth its weight in gold right there. And then I think kind of as we finally kind of begin to wrap up, what advice would you give then to the people who are on the ballot right now and waiting for those nominations to close? They have all their ducks in a line and they're just, it's that kind of anxiety building, and it's just that time between now and when the nominations close and it's all going through their head. What would you say to
them? Well, I've never actually stood in a student union election myself. Mm-hmm. So I don't know exactly the way it works, but once you get your nomination and it's all confirmed, well, then you have to get your plan of election put into action. So sit down yourself first, think about it. Don't just meet other people and then, you know, have a think yourself. Get together with your supporters and plan out what you're going to do. Look, it's extremely difficult now. I don't even know when the deadlines or when the elections are going to begin, but it's so difficult with the pandemic. And I don't know if the student unions are going to adapt the election campaigns in some way for that. I'm sure you will. Yeah.
No, that's absolutely brilliant. And I just kind of want to circle back before we close off about kind of, you mentioned that like obviously you weren't successful in the last election, but I think it's even important for students to kind of draw to that you know, you're still an incredible community leader, and you know, you're still like you're fighting for the Debenham workers. You're like, again, the mother baby homes. You're very active on all of these issues, and I think a lot of people can draw inspiration from that you know, and I'm going to draw a parallel to another thing that was said by a colleague of mine, that there's no such thing as losing an election. There's either winning or learning. And a lot of people can learn from their election, kind of, if they don't get it, but at the same time, they can still be 10 times the leader that people in their own communities are, who are elected. And the joys, even kind of from a student union perspective, is that if you don't get that election, you can be the person to hold that person to account on their promises and kind of still feed into the students' union. So it could be through our student council, or it could be through our class rep system or anything like that. And you can still really make those issues present and get them on the agendas no matter what. But I just want to say thank you so much, Ruth. And that actually brings us to the very end of our Tea Time Chats. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. I hope our students have taken something away from this. I know I certainly have. And I do want to say thank you for your time today. It's absolutely brilliant. Before we go, I always do this. Have you any social medias that you want to plug or anything just before we close off our Tea Time Chats?
Yeah, definitely. Well, look, obviously I'm on Facebook, Ruth Coppinger, and Instagram and Twitter. But next Monday is International Women's Day, and we can't have like mass mobilizations or anything on key issues like gender-based violence and so on. But I'll be speaking at an online meeting organised by Rosa. If people would like to tune into that, we'll be outlining the case for socialist feminism. We'll have a speaker from Debenhams, a speaker from the mother and baby homes issue, and we'll have Mina Kandazame, who's a renowned author and also feminist from India. So it should be interesting if people can tune into that next Monday at 7 o'clock.
Absolutely. And what we're going to do is, for that, we're going to grab the link for that and we're going to have it in the description. Other than that, we have our own social medias there. They're all going to be up around here somewhere, whatever way the editing is working on this, but they'll all be there. And on that, I'm going to say thank you so much to our incredible guest, Ruth Coppinger. And thanks everyone so much.
Thanks a million. Good luck, everybody.
And